Good day. This is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you for Reason to Resist from Montreal, Canada on July 15th, 2026. I'm very pleased to be joined again by our good friend, John Helmer. I've introduced him so many times that I'm simply not going to bother to recount to you his background. By now, our audience, John, will be very familiar with your rich and impressive body of work. Thank you for joining us again today.
Thank you for having me back, Dimitri. Welcome home.
Thank you. It's good to be back. So, John, today I would like to focus with you on two subjects. The first is whether Russia's intense drone and missile strikes on Kyiv have deterred Ukraine from conducting drone strikes deep into Russian territory and the politics around that whole issue. And secondly, I'd like to talk to you about a recent event that is, or at least should be, deeply embarrassing to the Greek government, namely a call between two famous Russian pranksters and the Greek government's national insecurity advisor, a fellow by the name of Thanos Dokos, about which you've written incisively. So before we begin, John, I just want to remind our audience, if they find this video to be informative, please like and share it. And if you're not already a subscriber to Reason to Resist, please do become one. Help us to expand the reach of our on-the-ground, unapologetic resistance journalism. So, John, with that, let's begin with the question of deterrence. The last time we had you on Reason to Resist, we talked about Ukrainian drones striking deeper and deeper into Russia. We discussed the damage these strikes cause, which, yes, has been to a considerable degree inflated by the Western corporate media and Western governments, but nonetheless is causing issues within Russia. And we talked about the Russian people's growing frustration about the Putin government's reluctance or apparent reluctance to act more decisively to deter these attacks. Now, since that interview, which took place several weeks ago before I went to Iran, Russia's military has launched a series of increasingly severe missile and drone attacks on Kyiv. And as far as I can tell, John, these attacks on Kyiv have done nothing to deter Ukrainian strikes deep inside Russia. For example, last week, Ukraine reportedly struck another Russian oil refinery. And this one, I understand, is situated in the Siberian city of Omsk, which is some 2,700 kilometers from Ukrainian territory. And here you can see a report in The Guardian on July 7th. Zelensky reportedly stated that Siberia was now within reach. And one other example I want to give, John, before I ask you about this, is apparently the drone strikes on Russian shipping in the Sea of Azov forced the Russian Federation to suspend shipping in that body of water after some 90 vessels were targeted by Ukrainian drones in less than a week. So, John, in recent days, you have talked about Vladimir Putin being forced in the coming days to make a decision about asymmetrical measures, and the view within the Russian intelligence and military community about what is going to have to be done to put an end to these attacks. Could you please elaborate on that? Do you think that there has been any evidence of deterrence established by these attacks on Kyiv, and where do you think all of this is heading?
Deterrence, there's not. And that's just plain raw arithmetic. What's happening, you summarized pretty well, Dimitri, and there's not a great deal of purpose to be served for our audience if I come up with some more numbers, but let me try to make it a general summary. We not only are facing in Russia the loss of more than 30% of refinery capacity. As you say, the Omsk refinery is more than 2,000 kilometers from the launch point in Ukraine, and that leaves only one major refinery, Angarsk, which is in Irkutsk region, beyond range. This means that not only is there loss of refinery capacity, there is a disruption of the logistics of supply between regions that are more short of gasoline, jet fuel, diesel, and other petroleum products. between regions that have got surplus, regions that are short. So we have a disruption of the logistics. We have a disruption of aircraft depending on jet fuel supplies. We have a reaching into reserve stocks of diesel, jet fuel, and other fuels. As we go through the summer driving season, there's disruption, particularly at independent petrol or benzene or gasoline stations, as distinct from the major national producers, Rosneft, Lukoil, and others. There is all of that on the fuel side. The fuel side affects the farm sector. The farm sector obviously depends on diesel to fuel harvesters. In a harvest season, which we're in, we have increased problems admitted by the Deputy Prime Minister in charge of Agriculture, Dimitri Lascaris, that make management of fuel supply for the harvest season problematic. And that in turn has been exaggerated, accentuated by the Ukrainian attacks you've just described on the Sea of Azov, which is a principal export route for Russian cargo vessels carrying grain exports abroad. So there is a clear attempt by the Ukrainians to demonstrate their deterrence against Russian grain trade as well as energy trade. And this has produced what President Putin 2 days ago referred to as a mirror retaliation. And you asked about Kyiv. Let me come to Kyiv in a minute, but over the past 24 to 36 hours, the mirror retaliation has been focused on Odessa, on the port of Odessa, to disrupt the ability of the NATO allies to deliver arms and other strategic cargoes through the Black Sea to the port of Odessa. There's been massive attacks by the Russian missile and drone forces in and around Odessa, not only aimed at incoming shipping and the transfer of and cutting off of NATO resupply through the shipping route, but also to attack the Flamingo and Neptune missile launch sites in and around Odessa. It's not the first time the Russian armed forces have been hitting Neptune launch sites. They are used to attack Russian shipping in the Black Sea. So I'm not going to say, and I don't believe the evidence warrants any loss of confidence in the Russian armed forces with their existing capacities, their budget, and material supply resources. They're doing the best they can. However, to get to the point of deterrence, the ability to deliver deterrent blows is limited by the presidential decision. The presidential decision, politely or courteously or carefully, cautiously referred to by Russian military bloggers and commentators as the political decision. That remains President Putin's commitment to symmetrical, balanced, tit-for-tat retaliation, rather than what the internal, according to my sources, intelligence assessments, foreign ministry recommendations, and the majority of the Security Council have been recommending as a significant step up, an E-day, an escalation day of major surprise attacks, which would do more than the Russian forces have been allowed to do so far, and abandon President Putin's magic mirror. There is no magic mirror in this war. And the reason is that both the United States and the Europeans and all the NATO allies have agreed at the Ankara summit, as Trump agreed at the previous G7 summit in France to increase the pressure on the Russian economy and increase the capability of the Ukraine in terms of financing, $70 billion this year, $70 billion pledged for next year. In other words, to make it possible for the Ukraine to continue to wage war on an escalating basis for at least 2 more years. So there are a range of options. These are being politely placed by Ukrainian opposition leader, for example, Sarov, who's based in Crimea, where the electricity is out over seriously large parts of Crimea on account of Ukrainian drone attacks. Electricity outages in the Crimea are serious disadvantage. These are not pinprick attacks any longer. What Sarov is saying is pointing out that the political decision, meaning President Putin's, is to be made to do a number of things. This is echoed in Moscow by State Duma deputies like Mikhail Delyagan and others. It's a series of proposals for escalated targeting. What would it do? It would cut the Ukraine completely off all resupply routes. If we have agreed that the purpose of the mirror escalation in Odessa was to cut off the sea route, there is no comparable escalation of attacks that cut off Kyiv from the Polish border, from Rzeszów, the Polish NATO resupply hub, which sends in NATO leaders. Lindsey Graham recently, prior to dying, used the train. That train shouldn't be running any longer. Most Russians believe the train delivery routes, the truck delivery routes, have not been cut off. The attacks on Kyiv, as you said, do not attack drone manufacturing plants, no doubt about it. But the Ukrainians have diversified, cut down the scale of the drone manufacturing plants, and are now, by co-production agreement with France, with Germany, with the UK, with the Latvians and others, producing drones and drone components outside of the Ukraine for shipment into the Ukraine. These can be cut off at the border. Okay. So
may I just stop you there?
Yeah.
I'm not a military expert, but it's not clear to me how you could cut them off. It sounds to me like you're talking about strikes confined to Ukrainian territory. Is that correct?
Correct. Yes.
Okay. So you blow up a railroad, or put a massive crater in a road, that can be repaired quite easily in a matter of days, if not less than 24 hours, depending on the extent of the damage. I mean, I just had an experience where the US military struck a railway bridge between Tehran and Mashhad, where I was at the time, where the final day of the funeral of Ali Khamenei took place. And the Iranians managed to repair that in less than 24 hours. So I don't see how this is going to, if all they're talking about doing, John, is blowing up bits of the railway between the Polish border and eastern Ukraine, or blowing up major highways, I don't see how that's going to do anything more than somewhat slow down the delivery of goods. It certainly isn't going to stop. I would think it's not going to stop this massive quantity of equipment and arms coming into Ukraine, is it?
Well, it hasn't been attempted yet, Dimitri. You're quite right that it's rail damage, for example. There've been, over the last 4.5 years, lots of attacks on Ukrainian rolling stock, destruction of the diesel storage that fuels diesel locomotives, attacks on rail hubs. All of these are capable, as you say, of being repaired relatively quickly, but the speed of repair depends on resupply. And so the level of concentration and repetition of attack has to be so sustained as to make repairs and replacements and resupply longer and longer. And of course, you're quite right, and we need a materiel expert, military supply expert, who's in a position to say what level of damage can be done inside the Ukraine. The reason I emphasize the point now, and there are some other targets, for example, Starlink in space, the guidance systems that are used to target these drones, either Starlink in space, satellites in space, or Black Sea drones. Those are also identified as targets which haven't been attacked yet. But let's go back to the cutting off of the border. The alternative to hitting the escalation of the drone war inside the Ukraine is the theory popularized by some US bloggers and podcasters, is a Oreshnik conventional warhead or Oreshnik tactical nuclear warhead attack on the NATO sources of supply. The Russian side has been amplifying this as a potential attack for deterrent purposes. So you have somebody like Sergei Karaganov, who has publicly, as a think tank, a spokesman for Kremlin policy and as a purported advisor to the Kremlin, raising the possibility of tactical nuclear weapons use as a deterrent by talking, by jawboning. We've also seen lots of re-amplification of tactical nuclear weapons being used by the Russian side against the NATO sources of supply. And there's that considered as an alternative. The reason that's talking and jawboning rather than realistic is the calculation first on the Russian side that even were tactical nuclear weapons to be used, the result would not be to deter the long-term NATO commitment to permanent war against Russia. It would in fact reinforce and accelerate NATO rearmament, militarization of Germany, the UK, and the other states. It wouldn't have any deterrent effect. It would, in the Russian calculation, reinforce the link between the United States and the NATO powers, which President Putin, advised by people like Kirill Dmitriev, believe can be split, divided, neutralized. Their theory has been to minimize the extent of the Russian escalation moves in order to preserve the opportunity for a Trump administration to neutralize NATO's commitment to a long-term war. Well, basically, in the last month, President Trump has demonstrated that whatever he says against Spain, for example, or against the Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, or the outgoing UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer, whatever he says negatively, he offsets by positive remarks towards NATO and his signature. I mean, yesterday in White House, in a meeting with the Prime Minister of Iraq, he spoke of his meetings at the NATO summit in Ankara as a love fest. He actually, I think, used the phrase, it was a love fest. In other words, one has to take all of Trump's negative remarks about NATO with more than a grain of salt. It's stagecraft designed to persuade the NATO countries to pay more within the US protectorate. And that's a Trump fundamental strategy that hasn't changed. What's changing is the readiness on the Russian side to come to the conclusion that Trump is as committed to long-term war against Russia as Lindsey Graham was, without saying so, as committed to long-term war against Russia, as Merz, Starmer, Macron, and Maloney all are, and we could go through the list of the smaller NATO countries committed. So you're right to express skepticism that any Russian action, escalation or no, is subject to the logistic resupply and repair capabilities on the Ukrainian NATO side. At the same time, what we haven't seen is such a sustained combination of attacks on transportation links of the kind I've just mentioned, none at all on the Polish border, combined with the electricity war, about which I've been reporting for some years now. To knock out electricity supply is not so easy to replace. The cost of replacing significant parts of a distribution network, any electrical engineer will tell you, is the cost, the difficulty, the delay, all going up. But as long as you can see lights burning in Lvov region and in the center of Kyiv, you understand that the electric war campaign has failed to deliver a significant deterrent effect that brings the Ukraine into a negotiated settlement on the Russian terms. So we come back to the general point. One, much has not been attempted. And the reason President Putin said 2 days ago, them repeated that Russian attacks are of a special military operation type, not a war fighting type. They must be mirrored, in other words, symmetrical, tit for tat. The reason he said that is he's under considerable internal pressure to change that line. Even Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said 24 hours ago in Moscow that asked what's to be done about the attacks on shipping that you've just mentioned, Dimitri. Lavrov referred to it as pure terrorism, worse than piracy, but pure terrorism. And that's to repeat the line that Putin has insisted on, that Russia is not in permanent war with NATO and the United States. There's some confusion on that point. But if you treat attacks on shipping, whether close to Russian waters like the Black Sea, the Sea of Azov, or far away, and we'll come to the Greek case in the Mediterranean shortly, we're talking about war. We're not talking about piracy, and we're not talking about pure terrorism. And the means to fight the drone campaign at sea, they are also delayed, promised, unimplemented. So until we get a significant change in strategy from the magic mirror to an E-day, an escalation day, we don't even begin to answer your question. How can Russia's armed forces, doing the very best they can as they advance slowly westward on the ground, deter the escalation they're now facing?
So I just want to offer a few observations here, John.
Sure.
First of all, if what we're talking about here are strikes that continue to be confined to Ukrainian territory, and if in fact this can be effective to cut off or severely impede the flow of supplies from NATO countries into Ukraine, for the life of me, I can't understand why the Russian government didn't do this years ago. What possible reason would they have had for refraining from attacking the principal roads and railroads that are being used to ship gigantic quantities of weaponry into Ukraine to be used to kill Russians, not just Russian soldiers, but Russian civilians. So I can't for the life of me understand why they're talking about it only now. That's the first thing. The second thing is, and I can't not point this out. It's so I think it sheds a lot of light on the mentality of the Russian government vis-a-vis this NATO proxy war. Iran, which has no nuclear deterrent, is, as we speak, attacking U.S. military bases in West Asia, and there are plenty of indications that they are inflicting severe damage on them as we speak, and that they have been doing so for months, and they have no nuclear deterrent. And yet Russia, which has the largest nuclear arsenal in the world, will not even attack a NATO pipsqueak like Latvia. I'm talking about a military target. I'm not talking about killing Latvian civilians. There are military bases in Latvia that I'm sure are playing some role in supporting the NATO proxy war. Same thing with Estonia, Lithuania, Poland, and on and on and on. Russia won't attack any of them, let alone U.S. military bases, despite the fact it has the largest nuclear arsenal in the world. And the third observation I want to make is you talked about this calculus that if they attack a NATO country, they'll accelerate their military spending. Frankly, I think they're already maxed out at increases in military spending. They have gone the extra mile in response to Trump's demands for absurd levels of spending, 5% of GDP. And that is probably beyond their fiscal capacity already. So, I mean, how much faster could they possibly go in terms of militarizing? They're maxed out. Their credit card is totally maxed out. So anyways, I'm just, the long and the short of it is, John, I don't really understand the thinking here behind the Russian government. It is winning on the ground. And this takes me to my next question. In the podcast universe, we are seeing a lot of talk about Russia finishing the job. And there are some who go so far as to say that Russia may be able to, quote unquote, finish the war this year. Okay. Now, there's no question that Russia is winning this war on the ground. That is just so abundantly clear. But the problem is the pace of it and what cost is Russia going to pay as this drags on? And how will the Russian people react to the prolongation of war and the constant attacks on Russian territory? That's the issue. But the fact that Russia is winning on the ground in eastern Ukraine is, I think, indisputable. Now, let's assume, for the sake of argument, I don't buy this for 1 second, that they could, quote unquote, finish the job territorially before the end of the year. I mean, are they really going to take, for example, Kherson City and Zaporozhye, which is by far larger than any city that they have taken control of in the course of this war? But let's say, for the sake of argument, they can finish the job in the sense that they seize control on the ground of all the territory that Russia has annexed, and that they can also establish a buffer zone in the north, in the Kharkov and Sumy regions, which is a stated goal of the Russian government as well. I don't see any evidence that that's going to stop the drone attacks. They'll just keep attacking. And I want to highlight, in making my point, a poll that Gallup just did. And I'm going to show you two graphics from that poll. This is, of course, a Western polling agency. Okay, this isn't some propaganda, your Russian propaganda outlet. Ukrainian approval of Washington sinks to record low. 7% of Ukrainians approve of Washington's job performance, and 79% disapprove. The decline, the precipitous decline in approval, started well before Trump returned to the White House in January of 2026. And another graphic from this poll, 66% of Ukrainians would like to see the war ended by means of negotiation as soon as possible. And a mere 24% want the fighting to continue. Why am I showing you and our audience this poll? Because I think it adds persuasively to the notion that from an evidentiary perspective that NATO governments don't give a damn about what the Ukrainian people think. They couldn't care less. If they cared about what the Ukrainian people think, they wouldn't be adopting such a maximalist position in negotiations with Russia, and they would be making a good faith effort to bring it to an end. So they don't care. They don't care about Ukrainian losses on the field, which are enormous. So I'm coming back to my main point here, which is I don't think you can finish the job with these lunatics in NATO willing to spend all of this money, not giving a damn about Ukrainian public opinion, about the lives of Ukrainians, simply by seizing control of those 4 oblasts and some buffer zone in the north of Ukraine. You are going to have to go further than that. Correct. And I don't see how you can accomplish the goal of deterring, bringing an end to this war definitively without doing what Iran is doing, which is attacking some military assets of the West in a Western country. Happy for you to chime in and disagree with me, John.
Right. Well, I think it's not so easy to chime when you've said pretty serious things. I think I'd like to start by going back to where you started chiming at the beginning. At the beginning, and the reason this is called a special military operation, is that President Putin was persuaded by his intelligence services that the best solution for the escalating Ukrainian threat and prevent it becoming an attack on across the then stable Russian border was to attempt to do what the Americans had done back in 2014, achieve a putsch, a change of regime in Kyiv. The special military operation therefore began in February of 2022 with a special Russian military operation, a special forces move into the Antonov airfield, also known as Hostomel, and a battle ensued because the US and the Ukrainians anticipated the Russian move. What was intended was an attempt to force a putsch of military leadership to take over from Zelensky, underpinned by a successful special forces operation outside of Kyiv, backed up by a line of Russian tanks and other equipment designed to show that if there was a regime change, Russia would not enter Kyiv from Gostomel or from the line of tanks heading into Kyiv from the east. That failed. The plan of achieving a special military operation was defeated in what's called the Battle of Antonov Airport or the Battle of Hostomel. When that happened, not according to plan, when there was no easy, quick transformation of regime of the kind the Americans had succeeded at doing in February 2014, the Russians having failed in February 2022, President Putin then agreed to what we call the first round of Istanbul negotiations to try to achieve politically at the table what had failed to be achieved militarily around Kyiv, in and around Kyiv. That too failed. Why? Well, there are both Russian reasons and there are NATO and allied reasons that undermine the initialing of terms at that time. We then went into, as everybody understands, an attrition war, which President Putin was not planning to pursue. Why? Because, first of all, his objective was to make a special military operation that upset the life, business, and public opinion least. In other words, to run a special military operation while maintaining business as usual and life as usual as best that could be arranged in the major cities, Moscow, St. Petersburg, Tyumen, and others, and preserve the domestic economy and public confidence in his leadership to deal with a special threat, not a war threat. It's been inconceivable to President Putin and his supporters that they were facing a permanent war against Russia from a committed US-led empire. Imperialism as the enemy is not a term that President Putin has readily accepted, nor has he, in his domestic policy making during this war, readily accepted the idea that that against an empire, you can't have half measures. You can't have balancing or mirroring of military measures, military retaliation. The conviction, especially of the US podcasters, that Russia had escalation domination and would win the war within weeks, you recall, in 2022, in 2023, in 2024. You recall them. You recall ex-US Army officers like, well, we won't go through the names, ex-CIA men. Everybody was convinced, including me to some extent, that Russia could achieve a quick battlefield victory. They could not. The level of troop deployment, against the level of fortification, was inadequate. And the casualty levels have gone up steadily, so that the price in blood which Russia has paid is very, very serious. It's more than 200,000 dead now. It's not anywhere near the exaggerated numbers that the NATO allies and the press that you put up, The Guardian and others have put up. It's not as great, but the number is so great from a Russian point of view, 200,000 plus wounded, several other 100,000. These numbers are greater than anything that President Putin or the government anticipated or believed that the Russian public opinion would tolerate. And yet,
if I may interject there, just to give our audience, John, a sense of perspective, I believe the number of American soldiers killed in the Vietnam War, which went on much longer, was about 59,000. Yes. So you're already talking about a number, 59,000. You're talking about a number of Russian casualties. I agree with your assessment, by the way, based on all the information. I think that is a very fair assessment of where they're likely to be in terms of casualties. They've suffered in the range of 4 times as many killed in action as the United States did in the Vietnam War, and we saw the impact that had on American society. It's quite sad. Sorry to interrupt, but go ahead.
Well, and that underscores the success of President Putin in maintaining an extremely high and stable level of public support for his performance, of confidence in the future of the Russian economy to deliver the kinds of freedoms, prosperity, hope for the future for children, education, health. All of those things have been preserved through the loss of lives, which is extraordinary. The achievement and the loss combined is an extraordinary achievement, and it has to be credited to President Putin, as Russian voters do credit it. However, here we are in 2026, heading into the 5th year, and it isn't so much a question of war weariness, it's a question of doubt in the performance of the presidency and the government down to the regional level, or their ability to preserve what's been achieved and end the war as a series of threats. Against that, look what the empire has been able to do. The commitment from the beginning When do we go back to 1945, or should we go back to Allied intervention forces arriving in Russia between 1917 and 1990? How far back should we go to look at the way in which the Anglo-American Empire has sought to destroy Russia as a power in Europe? A very long time. However, what we've faced is the capacity of Russia to fight back and preserve itself and develop the capability through nuclear weapons to deter nuclear attacks of the kind that the US Air Force, Curtis Lee May and others, all revealed, documented by Daniel Ellsberg's War Plan book. All of those plans were to destroy Russia by nuclear weapons. Stalin's capability was to eventually deter that. And subsequently, we won't go through the history. The history is of an empire determined to destroy Russia in Europe. President Putin is the heir to a coup that produced a slow putsch, whatever one might like to call the transfer of power from Communist Party under Gorbachev to the Yeltsin period, to the arrival of President Putin in the year 2000. The confidence was that this empire would give up this objective, and that the permanent war against Soviet Union, then Russia, would be abandoned in favor of some form of peaceful coexistence. That was a hope. Russians believed it was worth hoping, and now it's gone. It's destroyed. It's being destroyed. So what then do we face? It's permanent war from the United States leading the Europeans in a scheme of as you put it, where the Europeans are increasingly taxed at their loss of welfare and all the other things to pay for the United States to protect it from Russia. But the commitment is destroy Russia. The confidence is that the Ukrainians, with or without people, just as you said, there's indifference to how many Ukrainians will survive so long as the territory survives as a firing platform on Russia. But it's not the only firing platform. It's not the only front. So from my sources, from the military staff sources that I listen to, from intelligence sources, from political sources, everybody understands, even if they don't discuss it, that Russia faces a permanent war situation and needs time and a pause to develop the economy, the mobilization, the industrial potential to deal with that. It's not a loss of confidence in the Russian economy's capabilities, but there is a fundamental difference on what that economic structure should be, what the base should look like in order to defend Russia in the long war, the permanent war. That becomes an argument about the nature of the economic base in Russia. And what does that do? It threatens fundamentally the oligarch structure of the economic base in Russia. And what does that do? It threatens President Putin himself. He is the heir to the oligarch structure created during the Yeltsin period. He has transformed it, modified it, but basically depends on it. Yesterday, he met Vladimir Potanin, one of the most significant of the oligarchs in the original 1996 loans for share scheme, through which the oligarch base was created during the Yeltsin period, and made sure that Yeltsin was re-elected in 1996. Potanin was in the Kremlin yesterday as a signal from President Putin. He intends to preserve that base. We don't have the time to go into all the complexities. There is an alternative, slight alternative, fostered in the last few days by The Economist, promoting Andrei Melnichenko's version of the oligarch base. But both of them are the same. Putin has a different view about this from the Melnichenko one. We don't need to go into that, perhaps. What I am saying, and I hope it's an answer to your question, is that the reason you do not get what you said would be what you'd anticipate is that under the, strategic conception, the combination of domestic policy, the combination of economic policy with military policy, President Putin has been committed to the belief that the United States could be persuaded to make good faith negotiation to give the Russian side a pause, at worst a pause, at best a reassertion of some of the confidence we had during the Yeltsin period. Not me, but the Kremlin had, that the US could be a reliable partner in mitigating German conflict with Russia, Polish conflict with Russia, that the US would in fact split from Europe and persuade Europe to come to terms, peaceful terms with Russia. I mean, I'm saying what we know to be untrue now. But I am also saying that President Putin has been committed to his economic base to say those things and believe those things and restrict his military means so as not to, as it were, break the conviction that the US would refrain from that long-term permanent war. Now we are at the point in which the escalation of drone war, hinterland, on the front, the near seas and the high seas, that escalation is a signal of permanent war now, not simply permanent war after a pause. Exactly as you said, it's the Europeans committed to that, especially the Germans, but not only the Germans, are indifferent to how many Ukrainians die on the front. They're indifferent to the number of millions of Ukrainians forced into exile outside of the Ukraine. They're indifferent to everything but Ukraine as a firing platform against Russia, much as Adolf Hitler understood Western Ukraine to be a firing platform, a launching platform against the Soviet Union. So we're back to a situation in which war against Moscow is the dominating feature for the long term of the empire. And that empire isn't falling down. Now, if you say, why can't Russia do what the Iranians are doing? We get into a slightly different issue. The question really is, can what Iran's capable of doing, what it's actually done, is it capable of ending the permanent war against Iran? Is it capable of destroying Israel's long-term war to destroy Iran? Is it capable of destroying the US bases, the US alliance with the Arab states, in such a way as to put a stop, not just a pause, in the permanent war to destroy Iran? Is Iran doing any better at that, whatever its tactical successes and its operational successes may be? Is it doing any more at changing that strategy than the Russian side are capable of doing in Europe? I would say, and I'm not minimizing the success of Iran tactically and operationally, and I'm not minimizing the amount of damage it's inflicted on US bases and on Israel's confidence in its expansion. I would say that Iran is not making a greater success strategically in putting a stop to the permanent war against Iran than Russia is doing, which is a very good reason for those two countries, those two leaderships, to understand they're facing this, looking down the same barrel of the same imperial gun. Mm-hmm. And that's why we come to issues of Russia's alliance with China, with Iran, with North Korea, and other states, including the small ones, Cuba, and once upon a time, allies like Syria. We come to the question of President Putin's performance as an ally in this broader strategic fight against an empire. Mm-hmm. Is President Putin trusted by his strategic allies, Iran, China, India, North Korea, Cuba? Is he trusted to honor his commitments, even to understand and accept that they are in the same boat? The answer is, regrettably, he's not trusted.
Well, since you're on that subject, let me I want to move to something that's very relevant to what you just said, John. Before I do that, though, I am of the view, again, like you, I do not minimize in any way, shape, or form the military accomplishments of Iran. But the fact of the matter is that the U.S. and Western military budget is so enormous that if this war were to be fought purely in military terms, the war between Iran and the United States, I think eventually Iran would lose that war. It simply cannot outgun the United States with this $1 trillion plus military budget. But Iran has something which is much more powerful, and that is control over the Strait of Hormuz and potentially also the Bab al-Mandab Strait. So I think if they use those weapons in concert with their military capabilities intelligently and assertively, they can put a permanent end to the war on Iran. But that's going to require...
No, you mean they can achieve not a permanent end, but they have to have a permanent control of the Strait of Hormuz.
Correct.
With a permanent capability to inflict enough damage directly on the United States, its voters, and its economy. Now, I agree with you, tactically, strategically, and operationally there. However, as you understand, Russia has a different and more disadvantageous problem. The problem is that Russia cannot inflict a pain comparable to the Strait of Hormuz on the U.S. voter, the U.S. Consumer. It cannot inflict that level of pain. If we then go to the U.S. side and look at the polls, we look at them as measures in an election period of what US voters are most concerned about. And they're most concerned, is exactly as you've said, with inflation, with the cost of gas, with the cost of everything that's being inflated because of the enormous cost of Trump's wars. Right.
Yeah, but they're also opposed to war, and they don't want a nuclear war. And one thing that Russia can do that Iran can't, Russia can inflict far more damage on NATO military bases than Iran can. With weapons such as the Oreshnik, the Iskander. I mean, yes, the Iranians have a world-class ballistic missile program and drone program, but Russia has, the ability to produce far more of these, cutting-edge missiles and drones than Iran does. But in any case, I don't want to go too far down that path. I want to just return to this whole question of trust in the Russian government. And one other observation I want to make quickly is it never ceases to amaze me how much non-Western governments cling to this fantasy that you can negotiate a peace deal with Washington. And every time we see this, somewhere lurking in the background is some oligarchy, screwing things up, whether it's in the case of Iran or Russia or wherever. So it's in any case, I just wanted to throw that out there. But let's focus a little more on this question of trust. And there's this whole series of reports that has come up about Turkey's S-400 system.
Yes.
So Turkey is apparently thinking about selling its S-400 air defense system from Russia which is arguably the most advanced air defense system in the world, certainly one of the most advanced, probably a hell of a lot better than the flagship air defense system, the Patriots. It's talking about selling it to the United Arab Emirates, which is a mortal foe of Iran. And now, to be fair, if it does do this, it's not like this air defense system is going to fundamentally change the equation in the Persian Gulf, in part because it's only going to be available to the UAE, and it's going to take time for them to learn how to use it effectively. But nonetheless, we know how this thing is going to get used if the Russians consent to the transfer of the S-400. It's going to get used to protect a state that is participating in the war of aggression on Iran, namely the United Arab Emirates, and that is closely allied with the Israeli genocidal entity. It's going to be used by them to negate, nullify Iranian missile and drone attacks, not just on the UAE, but possibly also on Israel or other military bases of the United States in the region. So this doesn't seem, and this is a report from the Middle East Eye, which is not friendly to Washington. And the report is that the Russian government views the potential sale of S-400 air defense systems currently operated by Turkey to the United Arab Emirates in a positive light. Sources familiar with the issue told Middle East Eye, while cautioning that negotiations have yet to be completed. John, what do you know about this, and how do you think this is likely to affect relations between Russia and Iran, if in fact the sale goes through?
To ask me what I know is a bit of to ask me to exaggerate. The Middle Eastern Eye description of the sale to the UAE is only one of the reports. The others include a potential transfer to Saudi Arabia or a potential transfer to Qatar. These are Arab reports. They're mixed. In other words, it's unclear exactly who would be the beneficiary of the transfer. Second, there is no doubt the president's spokesman, Dimitri Peskov, has conceded, has acknowledged publicly that there are discussions underway between Russia and Turkey on the transfer of the S-400s, which have never been fired by the Turks. They've been fired successfully by the Indians against Pakistani aircraft, Chinese equipped aircraft. But the Turks have never used the S-400. There appear to be no discussion of the return of the S-400s to Russia. That's an option that appears not to be under discussion. The Turks intend to transfer away from Russia to one or other of the Arab adversaries of Iran in the present war. The question then becomes, how does Iran view that as a potentially hostile move in its attempt to defend itself from that alliance? And second, what does Russia have to say to the Iranians that doesn't amount to a violation of the pact the two have already signed between Putin and Pezeshkian some time ago? That pact prohibits Russia from doing something with a third party that threatens Iran. There's no doubt about the language of the pact that Pezeshkian and Putin signed. It is vague on the extent to which Russia and Iran would cooperate militarily and in defense, but it's very clear that Russia would not aid a third party, not Israel, not the United States, not the UAE, not Qatar, not Saudi Arabia. That's prohibited. Now, that's not come up yet in Russian public discussion or in the security media. Karaganov can talk all he likes about Europe, but he's pretty silent on something as dramatic as this, as a signal of Russia having to make a very difficult strategic choice. On the one hand, Turkey is a major client and a major partner in receiving Russian gas and oil. As a NATO member, Turkey has been a bulwark for Russia, of defending Russia from the impact of energy sanctions in the Middle East, in the Mediterranean area, in Southern Europe, and so on. Turkey is a crucial ally or partner of Russia, and it has a particularly powerful lobby in the Kremlin. And we've seen that lobby at work in the way in which Russia behaved during the attack on the Assad regime. That's another story, another issue of President Putin's reliability towards allies. However, in this particular case, Russia is having to apparently choose between Turkey, where President Erdogan is in a succession problem of his own. He has medical problems. He has serious medical problems. And President Erdogan's family are one of the competing groups in a succession contest in Turkey. So we have potentially highly unstable succession in Turkey, combined with maximum US pressure to persuade Turkey to abandon its ties to Russia, and which will also lead to Turkey becoming potentially hostile to Iran. That's very seriously damaging to Iran as well. So we have all of these things in a very complicated mix, added to which you have Turkish troops flying their flag as they reinforce Turkish positions around Russia's military bases, Tartus naval base in Syria, and Hmeimim outside of Latakia, the air base. In other words, Turkey is exercising regional expansion aspirations, which have long been held, which revive the Ottoman interest in taking the Syrian coastline down to Lebanon and beyond the Lebanese border potentially. Okay, we have a lot of things happening that are complicated, and they emphasize Russia's relative weakness in its own war in Europe towards both Turkey, UAE, and Iran. So that's the context in which Russia must decide. And it could certainly do a number of things. For example, even if it abandons the option of returning the S-400s, it could, as it were, promise Iran that it will give them the key to neutralize any attempt to use S-400 on the UAE, Qatar, or Saudi Arabian part. It could, in fact, undermine the transfer while appearing to pacify Turkey to allow the transfer. I've also been told, a source that may or may not be correct, that there are corrupt personal or institutional interests on the Russian side in capitalizing on this Turkish transfer. I'm in no position to say whether that's true or false. I simply say it's part of the mix. So I'm trying to persuade you not to draw too clear a conclusion about what Russia can and cannot do in this situation, especially since, as I've said, it faces enemies in all directions. And we're in an election period in which Russian voters have to, as it were, vote for the United Russia Party of President Putin. And he's had now 2 major national rallies to hold those votes as an expression of confidence that the future will be as positive as Russian voters have believed President Putin can deliver. And let's not remember one other thing. People my age, people your age, people listening to us, people who are Russian never can forget the damage inflicted on Russia by the United States and President Yeltsin. The damage done to Russia, destruction of lives, destruction of hope, destruction of everything, including values, moral values, that was inflicted on Russia by Yeltsin can't be forgotten. Therefore, you've got to understand why Russians do not want a destabilizing period in which challenges to the succession and President Putin must retire sooner or later. So we have a great deal of trouble ahead of us. And that's what Zelensky regime, that's what the Trump regime, particularly the War Party in the White House, I mean Stephen Miller and others. I'm not saying Vice President Vance as a successor would be any less committed. He'll have other priorities. And for the time being, he needs to protect his vote base from the damage Iran is inflicting through the Strait of Hormuz. That's clear. But Russia's capability, Putin's capability to flexibly address all of these problems, all of them at once, as an empire that isn't falling down, but maximizing its pressure and its confidence. Very, very difficult. And I'm afraid that disappoints a lot of our audience who wish to come out of this broadcast feeling hopeful. That's hopium. It's an illusion. We are in a very, very dangerous situation. And when, the minute you say, why can't the Russians do to the European threat what Iran's showing? In other words, hit Israeli targets. The equivalent of Israeli targets would be Germany, Poland, Romania. Then we are in world war. We are in world war. And right. While that's not inconceivable, who wins such a world war is very difficult to predict. And no Russian voter will vote for a president proposing to win a world war against the empire.
Well, I would, to close it out, John, I would say we're already in a world war, and it can certainly get worse, but I think it is going to get worse if we continue down this path. At some point, somehow, there is going to have to be meaningful deterrence imposed upon the West in response to endless.
Well, that would take us a longer program. Yes, but for the time being, all of us have a limited time to live. Those who are younger, a longer time. But given what I've tried to say, everybody is likely to limit the amount of exposure to world war for as long as possible, to extend the pause, not a ceasefire, the pause in permanent war between empires, those who don't want to even understand or accept the talk, the language, an analytical method that we are dealing with imperial war, those who want to believe the US empire is falling down and is being defeated in such a decisive way on the Iran front or on the European front, those folks, regrettably, are smoking opium. And it doesn't help us deal with the short-term and the medium-term problems we've just gone through. I'm not disagreeing with you, Dimitri. I don't believe that you're smoking opium either, are you?
I certainly don't think so. I think we're going to see far darker days than we have seen thus far. There's simply no way to avoid that. I think ultimately we have every prospect of emerging from this with a civilized and just world, but we're only in the beginning, in my view, of a very, very painful period.